Really a blessing to be here, and enjoyed the Leadership Institute get-together last night. A lot of good people here, and amazing the attentiveness of the students and even the faculty that were there and staff, and even the visitors that were there, because I understand we have some folks that are visiting. Very good night last night. Hopefully continuing to be a good day today. What amazing worship. If you enjoyed the worship today, would you say, uh-huh? Uh-huh, good stuff. When I was a junior in Bible college, I faced a crossroads in my life, and I had 2.5 years done, well on the way to graduating and heading out into pastoral ministry. And one weekend, I went back to Louisville, Kentucky, where I grew up, and I, at the time, was at Cincinnati Bible College, but I went back and spent the weekend with some friends that I had from high school. And I ran with a group of guys. I mean, we were pretty tight in high school, and we're still friends to this day. Not all of them were Christians, and not all of them are Christians to this day. But went back, and we spent the weekend kind of hanging out and catching up on how things were going in our lives. And I got to hear about their upcoming internships that summer and how they were excited. For instance, one of my friends was going to do an internship with one of the larger banks in the United States. He was on the fast track. Basically, if his internship went well, then they were going to hire him, and he was excited about the fact that he was going to start with 6 figures for income right out of university. And then with all the benefits and the fast track moving forward in that organization, another friend of mine was getting ready to do his internship at a rather large law firm. And same kind of situation. If things went well there, guaranteed job when he graduated from university, and he could slide right into that and basically move up into the right in this world. Another friend of mine was doing an internship at NASA that coming summer. Yeah. And he was excited about that. Same thing, except he would have to continue and get his master's degree, which he did, and he now works for NASA and does really well in life. And I kind of shared the stories about my internship with my friends from the last summer in a small church down in southern Kentucky, and some of the church politics that go on there and the lessons that I learned about the hardship of ministry and the $80 that I made a week being there, and the prospect of going into pastoral ministry when I graduated from Bible college. And I will never forget driving home in my car back to Cincinnati, back to the dorm, and all of that going through my mind, thinking about the 4-year full-ride scholarship that I turned down to a university in Kentucky to go to Bible college, where I paid my own way. And thinking about, Lord, I know that you've called me to ministry, but man, I could probably still get in on that scholarship and get on the fast track like my closest friends, and, I could make a lot of money, Lord. And I wouldn't have to deal with the things in the church that I'm probably going to have to deal with if I'm going to lead in the church, considering what I saw in the internship last summer. And Lord, I could, if I make a lot of money, I could give a lot of that money back to you, if you would just release me from the call. And please understand that what my friends were doing, that's no reflection on them. There's nothing wrong with going up and to the right in this world if God blesses you that way and puts you on that track. But the difference was I was called to ministry, and I knew it. God had put that call on my heart and in my mind, and so there was this struggle. And I remember for 3 days pacing in my dorm room and then going over and shooting hoops in the gym and playing pickup ball and going to classes. And for 3 days I was haunted, and 3 days I was struggling with the fact in my 3rd year of Bible college, midway through, man, I could just bail right now. And I could go on a whole different track in life. And I wrestled with God over that, and God kept coming back and saying, but do you trust me? I called you to this. I never told you it would be easy. I told you, though, that you would have the highest of times in life, and yeah, sometimes you're going to have some pretty low times in ministry, but do you trust me, John? Do you trust me? And I can stand here and tell you today that if I had turned away from God's call at that point, it would have been about money, and it would have been about possessions, and it would have been about having the things that this world has to offer. That was what I was struggling with. And praise God, after 3 days, the Lord helped me get back on the right track. And if he hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here today. You know, I had said yes to the call earlier in life, and I had to say yes again. And just because you said yes to the call, maybe when you were in high school, or maybe your freshman year here, or you're going to have to say yes again. Because the things of this world and the paths that this world has to offer will come calling. Would you agree with me that when we make commitments in life, really those commitments make us? That the vows and the promises and the commitments that we choose to live by, they actually make us who we are in life? And it's when we break those commitments, it's when we go on a whole different path and we go our own way that really life begins to drift away. Today we face choices of how we will live our lives and what we'll live our life for. That's why I want to unpack a passage of Scripture today in Luke chapter 12, that when I was pacing in my room and going to the Word of God and praying and just really struggling with that, my junior year of Bible college, that helped me get through this, and the Lord really spoke through it. It's my prayer that he speaks to you today as well and encourages and challenges and convicts you to stay on the right path if God has called you into ministry. Jesus deals with this whole issue of money and possessions and all that the world has to offer, and he deals with it head on. So let's jump in Luke chapter 12, verse 13. There's a crowd that numbered in the thousands that are gathered around Jesus as he's teaching, and a man interrupts, and he says this. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." What's he saying? Well, he's saying, my dad has died, and my brother is hogging all the inheritance to himself. So Jesus, would you get involved in this, straighten him out, and tell him he needs to share some of the inheritance with me? Don't raise your hand, but how many people here have seen their families go through inheritance issues over money and possessions and things of this world when a loved one dies? Man, I have ridden in hearses before in between two different people of a family arguing on the way to the cemetery about who's getting what and why this guy's a dirty dog or this gal's a dirty, and had to say, hey folks, can you stop it? You know, we're here to honor the life of the one that's in the casket in the back of this vehicle, and you're arguing over what you're going to get. That's what this guy's doing here. He's saying, Jesus, would you get in the middle of this and solve it? And in verse 14, Jesus replied, man, who appointed me judge and arbiter between you? Jesus says, I don't want in the middle of that. That's not my job. And then in 15, then he said to them, this is the whole crowd, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And Jesus then tells a story. Don't you love it when Jesus tells stories? He tells a parable. And I would ask you right now, rather than read this in your Bible or just watch me read it, if you would close your eyes and just listen to this as Jesus tells it, and imagine yourself in the crowd as Jesus teaches this parable. Here we go. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God. You can open your eyes now. At this point, if I'm in that crowd, I'm looking deep within my soul. How about you? I'm thinking about the car I drive. I'm thinking about the clothes that are on my back. I'm thinking about what's in my 401k 503B, which is a retirement account. I'm thinking about the house I live in. I'm thinking about what money I do have in the bank, and all this is going through my mind. How about you? You might not have much, but you've got something. And Jesus presents to his followers an alternative to living life as a fool. How to be rich with God. So today we want to look at just a few choices that Jesus offers us in Luke chapter 12 in regard to living in a rich relationship with God. The first choice, I can either be greedy or I can be generous. I can either be greedy or I can be generous. When Jesus starts telling this story, in the beginning of the story, I actually like the farmer. I've known farmers. I have close friends through the years that farm for a living, and they work hard. They're in the fields every day. And it's hard sometimes to have a good yield, to have a good crop, and to earn a living doing it. Crops don't grow on their own. You know, weeds don't stay away by themselves. It takes some effort, and the farmer has to go out every day and work. He has to know when to plant. He has to know when to harvest. He has to know when to fertilize. And then you deal with weather. So this farmer has made a go of farming, and he's good at it, isn't he? I mean, he's a success, and he has a great harvest come in. He's got the good life and success according to what this world would define success as. But what happens, though, is when this farmer is productive and things are going well, it shows a fatal flaw in his life. His possessions lead him to pride. His abundance reveals a prideful heart in how he deals with it. You look at verse 18. Then he said, and notice what he says, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods." In one verse, he refers to himself 7 times. I think we begin to see the problem here, don't we? Maybe you have come to understand that success is a moving target. You know what I mean by that? The world says if you get to this rung in the ladder, you'll be satisfied and you will have made it. Man, you will have arrived. So you work hard and you claw your way up to that rung on the ladder, and then you go, man, I'm not satisfied. And the world says, oh, well, actually, when you get to this rung on the ladder, you'll be satisfied. When you get this much in the bank, when you have this as your, and you work hard and you claw and you get there and you have it, and then you go, no, I'm not satisfied. Well, you have to get to this rung. And success is a moving target in this world. And I don't know how this guy built bigger barns or why, but maybe it went like this. He walked outside one day, looked over at his neighbor's farm, saw his neighbor building a big barn, and said, I can build a bigger barn than that. I had a bigger crop than you, so I'm going to build a bigger barn. And I'm not only going to build one, but I'm going to build 2 and maybe 3 and maybe 4. It's a major point in the human condition, and it always has been. J.D. Rockefeller, do you remember that name? J.D. Rockefeller is one of the wealthiest and most powerful American industrialists in our history. And during an interview, they asked him, Mr. Rockefeller, how much money does it take to make a man happy? Do you remember Rockefeller's answer? Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. And I believe that all of us at times in our life have held to J.D. Rockefeller's view. How much does it take to make me happy? Just a little bit more. Moving target. Did you know that we have twice as many shopping malls in the United States as we do high schools? Let that one sink in for a minute. And some of you are going, wow, that's a lot of shopping malls. Where are they? Did you know that out of 210 countries in the world, we spend more money than 90 of those 210 countries? Get this, we spend more money in the United States than 90 of those 210 countries on trash bags, on what we use to put our garbage in. Let that sink in for a minute. It's all about having more stuff. How much can I have? How much can I get? Well, look at what Jesus says in verse 32 forward. He says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And isn't it interesting in this teaching to his followers that he starts out by saying, don't be afraid? Don't be afraid. What emotion dominates our culture that dominated the culture then and dominated every culture all the way back to Adam and Eve? Fear. Fear. And hear the good news from Jesus. If you worry about not having enough, or not having enough in the bank, or not having the newest of this or the best of that, or what your neighbor has, or what your friend has, or what the world tells you you should have, listen to the good news of Jesus. He said, your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Don't be afraid. Your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. And we're instructed to live our lives with extravagant generosity, even being willing to sell our possessions and give to people in need. And this stores up treasures for us where? This stores up treasures for us where? In heaven. Nobody can foreclose on your treasure in heaven. Nobody can repossess what you place in God's hands. And in heaven, purses don't wear out and thieves don't break in and steal. And rather than chasing the world's definition of success and then finding that there's no joy in that, instead store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And we do that through extravagant generosity, by blessing others from what God has blessed us with. I see this happen all the time through Antioch. When we go downtown into the Cedar Rapids area and we feed the hungry, which we do every week, and you're putting food on people's plates who haven't had a good meal in a while, and then they're going back out into the cold, and you see the joy that comes over their face and the satisfaction when they eat that food because of generosity, and you see it on the faces of the people that are serving the food and giving. I see it when we give clothes and jackets to people that don't have sufficient clothes or jackets. I see it on their faces and on the faces of those who are giving. I see it on the faces of the little children that are going to schools in the Marion district who come from lower income families, and we provide jackets and backpacks and school supplies and even some games and some candy and things that they don't get on a regular basis. And when they get those things, their faces light up, and we tell them, hey, we're giving this to you because of Jesus. And you see the true joy that comes over the faces of those that are giving and those who are receiving. I see it when we give blankets and socks and pillows and food and shelter and medical help, and the love of Christ goes out from Antioch into the local community all the way to the ends of the world. When we're in Africa and working in a clinic and helping kids who have never even seen a doctor, and moms who have never taken their kids to a doctor. Have you ever been in that moment when everything good and pleasing and perfect through the will of God just seems to come together in that one moment of reality? Have you ever been in the middle of that? You know what I'm talking about? Have you ever been in the moment when you're fully alive and every tissue in your body and every nerve ending says, this is what the kingdom is about, and I'm in the middle of it? Can I suggest that if you've had that moment, probably has something to do with giving. It's probably in a moment when you have given of yourself and from what God has given you, and you are extravagantly sharing that with others and not holding closely to the things in this world. That's the moment when we're fully alive. Jesus said, whenever we welcome a stranger, whenever we clothe the naked, whenever we feed the hungry, whenever we help the sick, we are doing it for who? For Him. which means he's in that moment, which means he's there. And that's what the kingdom is about. And he said, your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. And that's a choice that we all face. Will we be greedy and go after the things of this world, or will we be generous, from which God has blessed us? Another choice that we have to make is that we can either trust in possessions or we can trust in God. We can either trust in possessions or we can trust in God. Think about the farmer that Jesus told us about. He gives us a glimpse into his heart in verse 19. He says, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And this farmer has put his security in what? In his stuff. Ever since September 11th, 2011, I have noticed a shift in our nation that we are obsessed with security. I mean, even the federal government has its own department called the Department of what? Homeland Security. And we need to be concerned about national security. We need to try to keep our nation safe. But did you know that in the midst of the economic recession over the last 10 years, that while many businesses and companies are going under because sales have plummeted, did you know that the sales of security systems and safes have actually increased and gone up? It's been a good business. Why? Because people want to protect their stuff. People want to protect their stuff. Jesus has a message for you and me starting in verse 27. He says, consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Jesus is reminding us that he gave us all of our stuff to begin with. Everything that you have, everything comes from God. Have you ever seen the movie The Blues Brothers? Raise your hand if you've seen the movie The Blues Brothers. Yeah, there's quite a few of us. In this great theological classic, the Blues Brothers say, we have talent on loan from God. And that's what they say before they perform. Rush Limbaugh's camped on that phrase for years. And actually, listen to me, if that is said with humility, that's actually pretty good theology. Life is a gift to us from God. Everything we have is a trust to us from God. And we've been entrusted with every single possession, every single dollar that we have. In every real sense, every one of us here are trust fund babies. And someday we'll have to give an account for everything that God has given us and how we used it. And this is why followers of Jesus give back. We give back. And here's the deal. We give back because we know the money that we have, we know the possessions that we have, they came from him in the first place. And frankly, God doesn't need our money. He needs for us to learn how to give. That's why he asks. I mean, do you really think that God is sitting up in heaven saying, you know what, I'm short on cash today. I really need you to give some more money because I'm running short over here, folks. God doesn't need your money. He doesn't need my money. What he needs and why he asks for us to give is he needs us to learn how to open up our hands instead of grasping things to let go. And to say, you know what, God, I trust you. You're going to take care of me. And therefore, I will give back to you from what you've given me. And I'll give generously. Because I will not allow greed to have a hold of my heart, and I will not trust in my possessions for my security, Lord. I will trust in you. And when we give, we're taking seriously what we wrote on the back of our currency to begin with. In God we trust. Do we trust in possessions or do we trust in God? Then last of all, I can live for today or I can live for eternity. I can live for today or I can live for eternity. The farmer in this story is summarized with one word. And it's a word that I don't like very much. His whole life, his whole existence, his whole blip on the radar screen of life and humanity is summarized with one word that I don't like. You look at verse 20 again, but God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you, then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Jesus calls this guy a fool. It's a pretty harsh word. Why would Jesus call him a fool? This man was a fool because he was living for the moment. He wasn't living for eternity. He was consumed only by the here and now, only by what he could see. And for some reason, this guy missed what most people miss around the world today. He missed this statistic that I tell my church all the time, and it's held true ever since the time of Adam and Eve. And yeah, you've got a few that through the power of God are exceptions, like the one that rode up into the heavens on a chariot. But other than a few exceptions, 1 out of every one of us in the history of humanity die. 1 out of every one of us, the odds are pretty certain on that and pretty true. 1 out of every one of us die. And when Jesus told this story, it was true back then as well. But for some reason, this guy forgot it, just like people today forget it. And Jesus drives home this point, starting in verse 22. He says that, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens, they do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest?'" Jesus is saying it all comes down to perspective. He's saying you need to view your life from an eternal perspective. And as disciples, we live life aware of a different time zone than what most in this world live by. And yeah, within the confines of this world right here, we're living in Central Standard Time, right? You go east of here, you hit Eastern Standard Time. You go west of here, it's a different time. And yeah, we have to live in the confines of that. But as believers, we live in an eternal standard time zone. We know that this life is temporal, that this is not it. And we have a different perspective. The Apostle Paul lived in the eternal standard time zone. That's why he could say to live is Christ and to die is gain. Because he knew this life is only temporary. What part of temporary do we forget? What part of temporary do we not so often understand in this life? Martin Luther King Jr. had this perspective. On April 3rd, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, he's at a Baptist church and he's preaching. Now, please understand that April 3rd, 1968 is the day before he was assassinated. And this is what he said when he preached. He said, "I don't know what will happen now because we have some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. He has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. And I might not get there with you in this life, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, and I'm ready." When you hear that, do you hear the different perspective that Martin Luther King had? He wasn't worried. He could say with the Apostle Paul, "Whether I live or whether I die, if I die, then it's gain, because I'll be with Christ." And I don't know about you, but I need a different perspective than this world gives about possessions and money, and I need to quit worrying about it. Don't you need a new perspective on those things? Aren't you tired of reading articles every day of how the economy is going to tank? Aren't you tired of hearing doomsday reports? Aren't you tired of how everything's falling apart and there's no hope? And aren't you tired of all that? Tired of hearing how this car is the one you have to have, so you better make these payments? Aren't you tired of this is the house you got to live in? Aren't you tired of this is how much you need in the bank? This is what it means to really live, to make you happy. And it's a moving target. God says, don't be afraid. It gives your Father great joy to give you the kingdom. So how do we break the back of greed? Well, as followers of Christ, we give. And we give generously. That's what opens up our hands rather than allowing them to continually grasp. And when we give to God, we're breaking the back of greed and we're saying, I'm living in an eternal standard time zone because I'm storing up for myself treasures in heaven rather than worrying about things on this earth. Not going to just live for today. I'm going to live for eternity. One of the greatest givers that I've ever met was my grandfather. And I knew him as Grandpa Seitz. He's a godly man. He put other people above himself, and he was an extravagant giver. When he died, I remember being at the funeral in the church building where he had gone every Sunday to worship with other believers. And as I sat listening to the pastor preach his funeral in that church building, my mind drifted back to the discussions that my grandpa and I would have on weekends about the sermons and how my grandpa enjoyed hearing the word. And then he would talk to me about what the preacher was preaching about. And we went to different churches. But my grandpa was always positive about the leaders in his church and about the preachers. And he would say, man, he really made a point this week that really resonated with me. And he talked about this passage of Scripture, and he would tell me some things. And then I can remember sometimes he would say, and he used this illustration, and I read that illustration in Reader's Digest a couple of weeks ago. He's got good taste in illustrations. And my mind's drifting back to the discussions that we would have out working in his field when he'd talk about the greatness of God and the power of God to create all of this. And at night sometimes when we worked till after the sun went down, looking up at the stars, and he would literally like a kid get this awe-inspired tone of voice and say, can you imagine the power of God to create all of this? How awesome he must be and is. While carrying the casket out of the church building to the hearse so that we could take him to the cemetery for the graveside service, I had a view of time through that whole process. I had a view of eternity as I stood there by the graveside and watched his casket lowered into the ground. An eternal perspective, because as I watched that, I knew in that moment as a young man that someday, if Jesus doesn't come back first, someday they're going to have a funeral service for me, and they're going to carry me out in a casket, and they're going to load my body in a hearse. We're going to go to a cemetery, and they're going to lower my body into the ground. And the reality is the pastor's probably going to say a few words at the cemetery. Then everybody's going to say goodbye, go back to the church, and eat potato salad. And if they're lucky, they'll have fried chicken. That's the way it goes, is it not? And standing there, I committed myself again to God as the wind blew around me on that cold day, that, you know what, God, I want to be faithful in all things. I want to be like my grandpa. He was faithful. And he was faithful because he followed you. And I want to be that way. I just want to be faithful to you in all things. And listen to me, when everybody comes back to eat potato salad at the church, it won't matter because you didn't leave me at the cemetery. You know where I'll be? I'll be standing with Jesus. And I'll be looking in his eyes. And my grandpa might be there, and other people that we have lost along the way that are there now. But I'll be looking at Jesus, deep into his eyes, and in that moment, I won't care at all about all the things that this world wanted me to worry about. It won't matter how much money is in my bank account. It won't matter what kind of house I lived in, what kind of car I drove, what kind of clothing it won't matter. Are you with me in that? Can you see it in your own life? Can you see into eternity? Get that picture and ask yourself, when you're standing there with Jesus in that moment, what do you want him to say? Well, I can tell you I don't want to hear the word fool, but I want to hear the word faithful. And I pray that you'll join me, because we're made for so much more than all this that we're surrounded by, that the world says is what it's all about. And it's time to stop worrying and step into life in the fullest. And today I plead with you to follow the call of God. If he has placed a call on your heart to do ministry and to serve in the kingdom, to not veer to the left or to the right from that call, but to stay in the call and to follow him. And I promise you, when it comes to the end of your life, you'll be glad you did. Hear Jesus say, don't be afraid, because it gives the Father great joy to give you the kingdom. Follow him.